The film started with a scene showing a man named Brian Brown Easley, a U.S. Marine veteran. At that time, his daughter, Kia, asked him for a puppy as her birthday gift. Sadly, he was not in the best financial situation to grant his daughter's request. He knew too well that his finances couldn't even fulfill his own needs. Moreover, he was also a widower. After his retirement from his duty in Iraq and Kuwait in 2005, his life had never been the same. He had to survive in poverty since the government didn't provide for his life finances, despite being a war veteran. Surprisingly, he thought of robbing a bank to meet his needs. One morning, he rushed to the nearby bank called Wells Fargo. When he arrived at the place, he contemplated his plan to rob the place, but in the end, he decided to do it. When he went inside, he immediately approached the teller there named Rosa and quietly told her that he had a bomb inside his backpack.
Triggered the alarm.
Strangely enough, he demanded she immediately call the police department. At the same time, the manager of the bank named Estelle found out what happened at that time and secretly asked his employees to evacuate the visitors and other staff, leaving her, Rosa, and Brian at the building. Brian, who later found out that Estelle had acted quickly to evacuate everyone, praised her for her quick action. Not long after, Brian had finally connected to the police called. On the call, he threatened to trigger the bomb with the hostages if the police couldn't meet his demand. He felt that he had been aggrieved by the U.S. Veteran Affairs. At that time, he pictured himself as a huge threat to the hostages while in reality, he was very polite to both Estelle and Rosa. Not long after, the police asked what clothes he used. Feeling unsafe, he disconnected all the surveillance cameras in the building.
You got the sniper on me.
He felt that he was monitored by the sniper. Angrily, Brian asked both Estelle and Rosa to contact as many journalists as they can contact so that they could report the crime and would become public attention. They were confused by the strange command by Brian, but they still did it so they wouldn't get hurt. Not long after, the police started appearing in front of the building. Rosa, on the other hand, tried to offer some money that Brian needed, but he instead refused the offer, because his true intention was not to rob the bank, but to show his disappointment against the U.S. Veteran Affairs that had disserved him. Suddenly, a gunshot was heard and made Brian angry. He threatened to trigger the explosion. He demanded the police connect him to a negotiator from the U.S. Veterans Affairs to discuss the problem. They ended up granting his demand and immediately connected him to the negotiator. At that time, Brian told the negotiator all the complaints he had against them about their ignorance of his condition that almost ended up being homeless. After a long negotiation, he demanded they fulfill his rights, but instead, the negotiator told him to wait for further information. Feeling relieved because he had conveyed his demands, he then called his ex-wife, Cassandra. He asked her for reconciliation and to live with him again. He felt all alone without her. He knew that he would either end up in prison or be shot dead by the police. Cassandra thought that he was just joking with her and told him that she wouldn't grant his request. At the same time, while Brian was busy with his call, Rosa and Estelle intended to run away. Brian then switched to calling his daughter, Kia. He then promised his daughter a puppy for her birthday gift and told her that he had the money to buy it already. After the call, Cassandra felt worried about Brian, and that was when she saw the news on TV about the bank robbery. Even more, her own daughter also witnessed the news about her father. Meanwhile, around the bank, more police were seen guarding the building, from the FBI, GBI, and even snipers were ready to secure the area. Brian was busy with the phone again, but this time, with WSB-TV Atlanta. The TV station on the phone asked him about his intention to do the robbery in Wells Fargo. All staff from the TV station were busy trying to record the conversation. Brian, on the phone, told his story before he robbed the building. He was once a U.S. Marine that was drafted into the battalion in Iraq and Kuwait before respectfully retiring from the Army in 2005. He was initially warmly welcomed to America by his own family. He also found love, married, and had a daughter. However, as a result of the war, he was diagnosed with PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder that occurred after a person experiences or witnesses a traumatic event. He couldn't enjoy his time after his retirement since he ran out of money quicker than he thought. The U.S. Veterans Affairs promised treatment for his illness and guaranteed his life after his retirement, but the reality was far from the promises. On that occasion, it turned out that the TV station had secretly contacted the police and forwarded the call to the sergeant named Bernard, so that he could hear Brian's demands even though he was somewhere else. Out of curiosity, he ordered the TV station to end the call. He reasoned that they didn't have the authority over the case. He, therefore, intended to contact Brian himself with his personal number. Soon, he finally connected to Brian and had a conversation with him. They greeted each other and chatted casually. At that time, Brian tried to ask Bernard to convey his demands to the U.S. Veterans Affairs so the request could be granted quickly. Bernard asked how much money he demanded the institution to pay. Strangely, Brian only asked for $892. At that moment, Rosa and Estelle were secretly listening to the conversation. Bernard promised Brian to convey the demands to the U.S. Veterans Affairs. Brian then told Bernard his last demands. It was to convey a message to his ex-wife and children, saying that he loved them so much. He was afraid that he would die soon. Bernard immediately cut his words. He guaranteed that he would make it out of the building safely. He asked Brian to remain calm. He told Brian to hide and not harm the hostages. After that, Bernard also negotiated with Brian to release one of the hostages as proof that Brian was not going to hurt them. Brian refused the negotiation, saying that he hadn't received the money. He told Bernard that he was being too demanding and immediately ended up the call. Suddenly, Bernard immediately called him back. He asked to speak with one of the hostages. Brian then gave the phone to Estelle. Bernard then asked Estelle about their condition, but she put the question aside. She instead told them to grant Brian's demand so the problem could be solved quickly. She then returned the phone to Brian. After confirming that the hostages were not harmed, Bernard initiated to meet Brian at the front door. Brian then agreed on one condition. He asked for a pack of cigarettes. Suddenly, Estelle told Brian that she would fulfill his demand herself and transferred the money right away, but to her surprise, Brian refused. Annoyed, Estelle told Brian that if the incident was not solved quickly, she predicted that he would be killed by the police outside. His ex-wife and daughter would definitely mourn his death. What she did that time was out of her sympathy for his situation. She wanted his problem to be solved more quickly and returned home safely. Brian was touched by her kindness and agreed to receive the money. It turned out that Bernard still monitored Brian from the security camera. He immediately ordered someone to limit the network to prevent the transaction from happening. Submit to the condition, Brian offered one of the hostages to get out of there as thanks for being kind to him. Unfortunately, both of them refused. They didn't want to leave each other in that situation. At the same time, Bernard was busy asking all his personnel to prepare for the trade between one of the hostages with a pack of cigarettes that Brian demanded before. The snipers were also ready in their position. They had targeted Brian and were ready to fire. When Brian was about to go to the toilet, Estelle planned to flee from the scene, but unfortunately, Rosa hesitated, afraid that their plan would be known by Brian and might harm their safety. Outside, the police were ready in their position, waiting for the command to storm into the building. Not long after, Brian returned from the toilet. He thanked them for their kindness and apologized for bothering them all this time. At the same time, when Bernard was approaching the front door to meet Brian, the sniper suddenly opened fire and Brian was shot dead on the spot. Accompanied by the other personnel, Bernard raided the building and evacuated both Rosa and Estelle. After the shooting incident, a robot was immediately deployed to secure the backpack that was indicated to contain a bomb. When they checked, they couldn't find any bomb inside the backpack. Bernard regretted the incident. The shooting and death surely could be avoided if they acted more carefully. It was then discovered that Bernard was Brian's friend in the Marines. Rosa and Estelle were sad about Brian's death. The same thing was felt by Kia. He remembered his father's warmth before he passed away. Sadly, after the incident,